Hey guys, Lincoln here bringing you another Elden Ring Nightreign video. And so I mentioned in a previous video where I talked about all the bosses that we know are going to be in the game confirmed so far, that I was going to make this future video talking about which bosses from the Souls franchise would people most like to see returning as bosses in Nightreign. So I put the links to the couple of threads that I made. I made one on the Elden Ring Reddit and on the Nightreign Reddit as well. So shout out to anyone who did go and leave comments over on those links or comment on the video itself. There was tons of comments, tons of bosses included. Shout out to everyone who commented Bed of Chaos, which obviously the meme answer would be absolutely terrible. One of the strangest bosses in the Souls franchise for sure. But I got a lot of very interesting replies. A lot of people mentioning bosses from Bloodborne and Sekiro as well, which I'm not sure if it's been completely confirmed at this point, but I am under the impression that we're not getting any bosses from those two games. But obviously let me know what you guys think, whether you would like to see those, whether I maybe could do a future video going over Bloodborne and Sekiro bosses. That would be interesting to have in Nightreign, but I think it is going to be just from the original like Souls trilogy and then Elden Ring. I think even Demon Souls is potentially unlikely, but I didn't get a lot of replies going over the Demon Soul, like mentioning any Demon Souls bosses. So rather than this be a video where we just scroll down and read the thread, I've picked out a couple of the bosses from each of the 3 Souls games that were mentioned the most. So these are the characters that seemingly are the most popular or most wanted bosses to return. So maybe I'll do a part 2. The thread has a ton of replies. I'll put the link in the chat in the description again, so if you want to go and add any other characters, maybe I will do a second part video, as there are so many bosses mentioned. And again, I can always do a video going over Bloodborne and Sekiro bosses as well. So we're going to go ahead and jump straight in with a couple of choices from Dark Souls 1. And probably won't surprise anyone to know that one of the most requested ones that was on the list, or most commented on the list, was Ornstein and Smo. Obviously this is a big boss fight when you get to Anor Londo in Dark Souls 1, fighting both of these guys at the same time. This fight can be incredibly challenging, and then of course once you've defeated one of them, you then have to fight the super powered version of the other one. So this would be very interesting in a format like Nightreign, right? Because designed for optimally for 3 players, right? Obviously, while it can be played solo, fighting 2 bosses in a group of 3 is a little bit easier than doing it by yourself. But considering the different kinds of attacks they have, Smo has especially the giant like jumping crush attack, which would have a wide area of effect. Ornstein has the various different lightning effects and the charge. It'd be certainly very interesting to try and manage fighting both of these guys at the same time within your team of 3. And of course, if they kept in, I guess it would depend whether they would be a normal boss that you fight or whether they are one of the Night Lords at the end of the run. And I guess that would determine whether or not they would still keep that feature where when you defeat one of them, the other one then becomes super powered. I'm assuming obviously if they were going to be a Night Lord, like final boss of the run, they would have that mechanic still. And then if they're just going to be a normal boss that you encounter throughout the run at certain points, then maybe they won't have that. But still fighting the 2 of them at the same time, certainly going to be very, very interesting. So these 2 very popular characters, definitely one of the most requested when it came to bosses from Dark Souls 1 that could return for Nightreign. Equally almost as close in terms of the number of like people recommending it and liking that comment and stuff, is a lot of people mentioned Artorias, because Artorias is a very popular character, obviously very cool design, but we also have the best boy or girl, Sif, the Great Grey Wolf. A lot of people commented, imagine if you got a boss fight in Nightreign where you fight Artorias and Sif at the same time. Because obviously Sif was a boss in the base Dark Souls 1, and obviously Artorias was one of the bosses in the DLC. So having the 2 of them together at the same time as a boss fight would certainly be very interesting. Artorias has some very cool attacks like the gap closing, like flip attacks and things like that. Sif obviously has the big like sweeping swings with the sword, a lot of like jumping away and then like spinning around sort of AoE type attacks, which would lend very well for a boss fighting against a group of 3 players. I mean, either of them would obviously make very cool choices as returning bosses in Nightreign, but fighting both of them at the same time would be a really cool boss fight as well. I think if we were only to get one of the two, I feel like Sif definitely fits the format a little bit better, being a giant creature, having those sweeping attacks with the sword, and it would just be cool to see Sif back again, because obviously, especially when it comes to any of these bosses from Dark Souls 1, you know, we got the remaster of Dark Souls 1, which didn't really do a huge amount improving the game in terms of visuals. So any Dark Souls 1 bosses reappearing in Nightreign would of course have much better and updated like character models and everything. So seeing Sif or Artorias returning in Dark Souls in Nightreign would be very, very cool. And another one I wanted to pick, just because I thought this was a really interesting choice. I tried to pick like an interesting one for the 3 games as well that not a lot of people mentioned. Somebody pointed out this guy, the Sanctuary Guardian, who is the first boss you fight right at the beginning of the Artorias DLC. And it's basically like a giant, crazy looking like chimera, right? It's giant white beast with a lion's head, horns, wings, and like a snake tail. The boss is not particularly difficult, which is why I think it's probably not like a super memorable boss necessarily for a lot of people, and you fight it right at the beginning of the DLC. Like you literally teleport to the Artorias DLC area and then you fight this boss like almost immediately. So I think people sort of forget this is like the very first step on the journey into the DLC, but the design of the boss is very cool. And it has some very interesting attacks. I think it would be quite interesting. Definitely would be a mini boss, right, that you encounter throughout the run and not a Night Lord. But I do think that is quite an interesting touch for a cool little boss that could just be thrown in as a callback to Dark Souls 1. But certainly isn't going to be the top pick for anyone, I'm sure. But I think that would be a nice little touch as a mini boss. So then a couple of the bosses that got mentioned the most from Dark Souls 2, we have the Fume Knight, who is obviously from the final fight of one of the 3 DLCs. You fight this guy in the base of the Broom Tower, and this guy's pretty crazy, right? He has the dual swords. I remember doing the recent Dark Souls 2 playthrough on this channel on the stream, and this guy took a fair few attempts for me to beat. I hadn't played through Dark Souls 2 in quite some time. But this guy has some very interesting attacks. He has the fairly powerful like sword combos with the dual swords. He also has the ability to buff the sword with the Dark Flame. He also can have an ability where he slams his sword into the ground and it creates a shockwave and a bunch of flame orbs. So something like that, which of course has a sort of AoE effect, is definitely an attack that would be very good for a boss in this kind of scenario, fighting against multiple player characters. So yeah, the Fume Knight, certainly a very interesting choice. And funnily enough, there's another boss from that same DLC that is optional that a lot of people mentioned, and that is Sir Alon. So this guy is an optional boss in the old Iron King DLC, and he's essentially like a samurai knight, right? So he's a knight in full armor with a helmet, but it has that sort of Eastern like theme, and he is using a katana. He can do bleed damage to you. It's quite a tough fight, but it's just a very cool like one-on-one duel in like a fairly small but not like very confined like room, and it's just a very good fight, like very good 1v1 fight, right? It's quite tough. He's got a lot of different attacks and can do quite a lot of damage. He also has a really interesting mechanic, which I've never seen it personally because I'm not good enough, right? But if you actually beat him without taking any damage, when you get him down to like basically essentially being almost dead, he actually, like, you know, in terms of the sort of samurai code, he actually commits seppuku and kills himself if you get him basically all the way through the fight without taking any damage, which is crazy. Would certainly be a very interesting boss for Nightreign. Crazy swordsman, especially because we assume any of these bosses that are returning, they're probably not just going to have their same cut and paste move sets, right? As we talked about in one of the previous videos, these bosses I imagine are going to get some new attacks or some reworked attacks that will enable them to, you know, fight 3 players, right? We know from the producer interview that bosses, like the game has been sort of balanced around 3-player co-op. So especially with these sort of 1v1, even though some of them are a lot larger than you, like humanoid style enemies, those fights in the earlier Souls games can be really, really easy if there is like 3 of you, right? So these bosses in Nightreign are going to be optimized to be able to fight against multiple people and therefore have a slightly better time of it. But Dark Souls 2 is one of those games that has some really interesting bosses. There wasn't a lot picked out. There was a couple of meme answers, like the Demon of Song, which I know is a really annoying one, the Covetous Demon. Like there's a few just really dud bosses in Dark Souls 2, which is unfortunate, but the DLC definitely had some very interesting ones. So a couple of Dark Souls 2 bosses made it into the list, but it was largely 1. And then, of course, probably due to recency, a lot of people's favourite bosses from 3 made it into this list. So we'll start off with one that I think would certainly be very interesting that was mentioned a few times in that thread, and that is the Abyss Watchers. Because obviously this fight, whilst they are humanoid enemies, which means you have the added advantage of being able to like backstab and stuff like that, you are fighting multiple of them, right? And then you get the one that like spawns up that has the frenzied mode with the red eyes, who you can kind of lure into attacking the other ones. But it would be kind of cool if the fight just literally started off and it's like a 3v3 against the Abyss Watchers. Like a couple of people mentioned some of these bosses from the previous games, and even when I said people mentioning like Bloodborne bosses like the Shadows of Yharnam, a couple of these bosses that are you fighting like 3 enemies, and you know, some of them were phantoms in some of these games, some of them were just actual boss creatures like the Abyss Watchers. So starting out just as like a 3v3 would certainly be very interesting. And of course, with the Abyss Watchers and how many there are and how their lore works and everything, you could potentially start off with 3, even 2, maybe even 1. As the fight goes on, more of them get added into the mix, which will certainly be very crazy. So the Abyss Watchers are very cool, obviously very popular. Their weapon, one of the first like really popular ones that people, once you start getting your hands on it, had the really crazy moveset that was getting used in PvP all the time. Like these guys were very popular in terms of design. So these guys I think would be a really, really good choice for a mini boss that you're fighting along the way, especially if you imagine, I know it's randomized, so you're not going to get the same ones every run, but because they have that direct connection to him, like imagine one of the Night Lord options being Artorias and Sif, and then you fight these guys as a boss like along the way. I think that would be very cool. So the Abyss Watchers definitely very high up there on the list. We also have a very popular choice, and I know a boss that a lot of people love from the first DLC for Dark Souls 3, and that is of course Sister Friday. So this boss was very, very interesting, right? You have the first phase where you're fighting her, the second phase where the fight takes off to a whole nother level when you get the other guy involved, whose name I literally now can't remember. And then, of course, this was the first fight in Dark Souls 3 that had more than 2 phases. And you end up beating her. You get the Titanite slab come up as the drop. And then all of a sudden, the fight's not over. And you go back to fighting her again. And obviously, a much tougher, powered-up phase. It's just farther Ariane now, isn't it? But yeah, her on her own. I imagine it would be her on her own and not her and him. Especially like the Black Flame version of her, just being the straight up version you fight, would be very interesting. Obviously, she's a boss that could be super annoying. She had the ability to go invisible and then launch that attack at you, which is basically like a grab, which could be really frustrating. And especially if you are in a group, like having her phase out and disappear while one of you is trying to fight her and then immediately appear doing that grab attack onto one of the other people in the party. Like, she definitely has some abilities that would lend well to fighting groups of people. And even, like I say, Father Ariandel joining in could be part of it, could be part of like the later phase. So she's definitely a boss that was a top pick in the thread. But it will probably surprise nobody to know that the number one that I saw people talking about, the one that I think people want to see the most, it's a lot of people's favorite boss in Dark Souls 3. It's probably a lot of people's favorite boss in the entire Dark Souls franchise, and I definitely rate him very highly among the list of like favorite bosses. But the number one pick that we would love to see in Nightreign as a boss is Slave Knight Gale. This guy is great. The boss fight is really cool. Really good mechanics. It's a really good fight. It can be tough, but I think a lot of people just really love like the story and the lore for Gale as well, and it just makes that whole story of like the Ring City and his journey and his mission to retrieve the Dark Soul for the creation of the new painting and all that stuff. It's just a really cool story, and obviously it has the sort of tragic ending where he is essentially helping you, like guiding you all the way to the end of the Ring City, knowing full well that the outcome, like the final step in your journey, will be having to defeat him in order to reclaim that blood of the Dark Soul. It's such a great story. Like, a lot of people, you know, will always talk about the lore for Dark Souls and how tricky it can be to access at times. Like, it doesn't just spoon feed you the story, but those of us who do, like, pay attention, read all the items, do that little bit of like deep diving outside of the game and stuff like that, like the lore and some of the story is just so good and so rich in these games, and Gale is a perfect example of one of these characters that just has a really great story, and then it ends with a really great, like I say, fight that can be quite tough. Especially like you get into the final phase, you've got the lightning, he's jumping around, flying around everywhere, shooting arrows like at you, teleporting around. Like, him as a big boss in Nightreign, 3 people fighting a super juiced up like Slave Knight Gale, that would be super fun. Definitely one of the top picks for bosses that people want to see return for Nightreign. So let me know what you guys think down below in the comment section. Out of all of the options that we've mentioned in the video, how do you feel about these guys if they were to return as bosses for Nightreign? Are there any that you'd be really hyped about? Any that you wouldn't particularly care about from this list? And of course, let me know down below in the comments, or go over to the thread. I'll put the link in the description, as I said at the beginning. Let me know any other bosses that haven't been mentioned in this video that you guys would like to see, whether they're from the original Dark Souls games, Demon Souls, Bloodborne, or Sekiro. Let me know over there, and I will make a part 2 video for this if we get another few lots of bosses, because obviously I don't want to make a secondary video that's only talking about like 2 or 3 characters, but as I say, that thread does have quite a few replies already, so if there's other bosses that you want to see come back for Nightreign, do let me know in the comments or over on that thread. So that is going to be it for the video. Obviously I will keep you guys up to date with any Nightreign news as it comes out. I will be planning to stream the network test, but you know, we're still almost a full month away from that. So any other news, I will keep you guys posted. So that is going to be it for the video. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you are new, and I will see you all next time. Peace out.